Gospel of Matthew. Reading from the Gospel of Matthew, according to Matthew. Now, it's going to sound like I'm starting right in the middle of something, but don't worry because I'm going to explain it all to you, okay? Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." And Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." And then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them then to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Thus ends the reading of the word. Now, it's important always to know the context of these kinds of stories. This particular feeding story appears in all 4 of the Gospels. It's in Matthew, it's in Mark, it's in Luke, and it's in John, and it's actually twice in 2 of them. So it appears 7 times in different forms in the Gospels. It's important to understand and remember that each one of the Gospel writers kind of has his own agenda, all right, and has his own place to put the story in his Gospel. Matthew has taken this feeding story and placed it in an odd sort of place in his Gospel, in that it immediately is preceded by this story that, if you've seen the Bible movies, you always see this particular thing, this particular story displayed in all the Bible movies. People love this story in the Bible movies. And it's the story about the beheading of John the Baptist. So this is chapter 14, verse 13 is where this begins. But chapter 13, the very end of the chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus has been rejected in his hometown of Nazareth. Now, we're wondering, Nazareth is very near Jerusalem. And I'm not quite sure if Jesus hung around Nazareth or if he went back up to Galilee. I'm thinking that he probably went back up to Galilee where he feels welcome in the company of his fishermen friends. There are some commentators that think he's still hanging out down around Nazareth and around Jerusalem. So the getting in the boat thing is, we're not sure where he got in the boat. Did he get in the boat on the Jordan, or did he get in the boat back on the Sea of Galilee? I would prefer to think that he got in the boat back on the Sea of Galilee. So he leaves Nazareth, goes back to Capernaum, the Sea of Galilee, a place where he feels welcomed by the crowds. Now, the story that begins chapter 14 is this story about Herod having a birthday party. That starts chapter 14. And he's invited all sorts of folks over to his house in that story. The beginning of the chapter begins with these words. At that time, Herod the ruler heard reports about Jesus, and he said to his servants, This Jesus is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. And for this reason, these powers are at work in him. Now Matthew flashes back to what Herod's talking about. Matthew flashes us back to the scene at Herod's birthday party, where everybody's having a ball, and his niece by marriage, Herodias, the daughter of Herodias, a teenage girl, in Scheherazade-esque fashion, does the dance, like with the 7 veils for everybody. And King Herod is so pleased by what she's done that he asks her, what can I do for you? I'm so pleased with what you've done. And according to the legend, or according to the story, she said that I want John the Baptist's head on a platter. Nice teenage thinking. Anyway, according to the story, John the Baptist's head is brought to the party on a platter. Then verse 13 begins. Now when Jesus heard this. Okay, you got the context? Jesus has heard about John the Baptist. The disciples of John the Baptist have come looking for Jesus to tell him what has happened to John the Baptist. And when Jesus heard this, when he heard what had happened to his cousin, to this man who was a beloved friend, to this man who was a prophetic equal wandering around the land trying to bring people into connection with God, when Jesus heard this, he had to find a place away. He got into a boat and looked for a deserted place away where he could escape the crowds and be alone to mourn the loss of his friend. In this verse 13, there's so much information. Jesus heard this, withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself, but when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. Now, I want you to picture this. Jesus is out, I think, on the Sea of Galilee in a boat, trying to escape the crowds, and the crowds, you've seen this in movies, are following along the shoreline the boat. Now, the Sea of Galilee is huge. There are towns that line the entire lake, and the people are following after this man who is trying to get away from the crowds, to steel himself, to mourn, to grieve, in the deserted, quiet place away. And Matthew tells us that suddenly Jesus realized that he could not escape the crowds. And he gets out of the boat and he comes to shore. And the text says, and he had compassion on the people, and he cured them of their illnesses and of their sickness. He immediately had compassion on the people. This morning as I was driving to church, I was reading. All of you know I listen to books on my iPod. And I was listening to Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese. And he had this line. I said, oh, this is so good for my sermon. He had this phrase that he said, people, in his case doctors, reach out to heal others because in so doing, they end up healing themselves. And I said, how remarkable. This is what Jesus is doing. Jesus is so full of grief for the loss of his friend, and at the same time, he is full of God and full of compassion for the people. And he gets out of the boat and he pours himself out to the people. He pours his compassion out to the people, and in so doing is healing himself. Now I want you to picture this scene that Matthew describes. 5,000 men and women and children. So how many people? Let's figure 20,000 people. Now, there's a great possibility that Jesus has the ability and the power to rally these people people against Herod for what he's done to John the Baptist. He could turn this into a political rally. There are 5,000 men there that he can pump up to act up. But that's not what he does. What he does is he ambles and he walks one-on-one, person to person, reaching out and touching the thousands of people that are there to offer them his love, his compassion, and his healing. And in so doing, the exchange is making him whole again. Now, I'm picturing his disciples, God bless them, walking around behind him, but they're not participating in this. They're just kind of following around, watching Jesus do this. And the days get long. The hours are passing. And suddenly, it's evening. Now, picture this. Picture this. They're in a deserted place. And it's evening. There aren't any streetlights, people. Nobody has an ever-ready flashlight. It's dark out there. And the disciples are coming up to Jesus going, hello? Get rid of the people. Send the people away. They got to go into the towns and villages. They have to get away from here. It's dark. They'll get eaten by wild animals in the middle of the night. Whatever they're thinking, I don't know what they're thinking. But anyway, get rid of those people, perhaps because they want their attention time with Jesus. But get rid of these people. Make them go away. Send them into the towns and villages to get what it is they need for themselves. I imagine they sent a designated speaker to Jesus. I don't think all 12 of them went. I'm sure they conned Thomas into it. Thomas, go tell Jesus that he's got to send the people away. Oh, dear Thomas. Anyway, Jesus says, they don't need to go away. Why don't you give them something to eat? I can just picture the faces. What? Say what? Are you kidding? What? Are you nuts? What are you thinking? There are 20,000 people out there. What do you mean? We barely have enough for ourselves. We've got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and they're not very big. That's barely enough for maybe the 13 of us plus the women, who were also the disciples that don't get mentioned. So that's barely enough for us. What do you mean? Feed them. You give them something to eat. What is that, Jesus? Up until this moment, they have not been participants in this day. Jesus says, bring them here. Bring the fish. Bring those 2 tiny substandard fish and the loaves. Bring them over here. And this wonderful scene. Now remember, it's pitch black. It's dark. It's evening. Maybe there's moonlight, but nobody can see what's going on. How is Jesus going to raise his voice high enough to say, okay, everybody sit down. We're having dinner. He lifts his hands to heaven. He looks up to heaven, and looking up to heaven, he blesses the bread and the fish. He breaks it and blesses it. He and God, in this moment in time, in this divine connection, bless and break the bread and the fish. And he hands it to the disciples. He doesn't go out and distribute it. He picks the disciples and he says, here, you distribute this. You give this to the people. And I would imagine that they can't carry a whole heck of a lot, so they keep coming back for more. And there's more to be given out. And there's more, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more to be given out to the people until everyone at Jesus' dinner in the deserted place is fed and full. And the disciples who had nothing to offer before this moment have become part of the compassion of Jesus. They have become part of the work of Jesus. They have become part of the blessing of Jesus. What they have been able to participate in is the giving of enough, is the blessing of enough, that all who were there received from Jesus and his disciples, and those who were working with him in his name. The people received enough. Even though the disciples didn't think they had it in them, even though the disciples didn't think they were capable of doing anything to fix this incredible conundrum of 20,000 people in the darkness in a deserted place, Jesus made them part of the blessing. And it gave me pause as I thought about the group of 13 people who were in Guatemala. The team each week was 13 of us. And we were 86 going on 87. We were 11 going on 12. We were in our mid-70s to late 70s. We were in our mid to late 60s. We were in our mid to late 50s. And we were 21 and 23. And we were 15. Those were our ages. We were engineers, and we were teachers, and we were nurses, and we were students, and we were computer geeks. And we all together were blessed with the opportunity to be enough, to be the disciples of Jesus, doing work in another country. And what we did, even as we tried to walk around or limp around in some cases, even as we climbed mountains that we couldn't even breathe as we climbed the mountains, even as we lifted concrete blocks that were pretty hard to lift for some of us, and even as we tried to build these stoves, we were together, working together, enough, and the blessing of Jesus Christ. It's important for us to realize that with the blessing of God and the blessing of Jesus